The mockery in the sky. The boy adjusted his black suit nervously. The fabric was pressed neatly, though it hung loosely on his thin frame. His mother had taken great care to make sure he looked sharp for this journey, and she had whispered to him that morning that no matter what happened he must sit tall because he deserved to be there just as much as anyone else. He clutched the handle of his small carry bag and stepped into the plane, his wide eyes taking in the shining interior of the first-class cabin where seats were bigger and the air smelled faintly of luxury coffee and polished leather. As he walked down the aisle, the crew noticed him, and their faces shifted in ways that cut deeper than words. One attendant tilted her head with a mocking smile as if silently questioning how he could afford a seat in this section. Another crew member whispered something behind her hand, and the soft sound of laughter followed like a sting. The boy ignored it, though his ears burned red. He kept his head high as his mother guided him gently toward their seats, her hand firm on his shoulder, reminding him he belonged. The first-class passengers were a mix of suited businessmen, elegant women with glittering jewelry, and travelers who seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Some raised eyebrows at the sight of the teenager in a suit. Some even shook their heads with a quiet disbelief. Their eyes carried the unspoken question, "What is he doing here?" The boy sat down, his small frame sinking into the wide leather chair, and he tried to breathe steadily as his mother placed their bags in the overhead bin. The lead attendant came by offering drinks to the passengers, but when her eyes fell on the boy, she let her gaze linger longer than polite. She leaned in with a smile that was not warm and said softly, so only he could hear, "Enjoy your first-class ride, young man. I hope it is not your last." Her words carried the weight of insult, and the boy felt them like a heavy stone in his chest. He gripped the armrest, his knuckles turning pale as his throat tightened with the effort not to react. He had been told all his life that silence was sometimes the stronger shield, and so he stared ahead, forcing his face to remain calm, though inside every laugh and every whisper echoed louder and louder. As the plane prepared for departure, a couple sitting across Pet leaned closer, and one of them whispered to the other about how the ticket must have been a mistake or a giveaway. Their words were sharp and careless, and they struck the boy harder than they realized. His mother returned to her seat beside him, her face calm but her eyes sharp and watchful. She had lived long enough to see how quickly judgment was cast on people who did not fit the image others expected. She placed her hand gently over his trembling fingers and whispered only to him, "You belong here. Do not let them take that away from youth." Plane lifted into the air, and the engines roared steady against the silence that sat between them. The boy tried to lose himself in the view outside the window, clouds stretching in endless shapes across the sky. But every now and then he caught the lingering looks from crew and passengers. Alike the whispers had quieted, but their presence was still felt, and every second reminded him that he was an outsider in their eyes. Then it happened. A faint vibration came from his mother's handbag. Resting near her feet, she bent quickly and pulled out her phone. The screen glowed with an unfamiliar number. She frowned and answered quietly, expecting a routine call, but the voice that came through the speaker froze her in place. The boy turned his head at once, sensing something different in her expression. The calm, authoritative tone on the other end said, "This is the White House speaking." His mother blinked rapidly, unsure if she had heard correctly. She asked the caller to repeat, and again came the steady voice, "Yes, this is the White House." The atmosphere shifted immediately, though no one around them knew yet. The boy felt his heartbeat pound so hard he thought others could hear it. He stared at his mother, his eyes wide, searching her face for answers. She was silent for a long moment, listening intently to the voice on the other side of the call. Her lips parted slightly in disbelief, and her fingers trembled as she held the phone closer. Her eyes flickered toward him, and the warmth in them grew brighter with every word. She heard the crew member who had mocked him earlier passed by again, and paused, noticing the mother's expression and the way her grip on the phone had tightened. Curious, she leaned slightly, but heard nothing of the call. Still her smirk faltered. Something about the tension in the air seemed to press against her confidence. The boy remained frozen, his chest tight, his breath shallow, his mind spinning with questions. Why was the White House calling them? Why now? And what could this possibly mean? Passengers nearby, who had earlier been entertained by whispers about the boy, began to glance again, curious about the sudden change in his mother's demeanor. She sat straighter now, her expression composed, but her eyes alive with something that even strangers could not miss, a mixture of shock, pride, and an unspoken truth that whatever this call was, it mattered more than the laughter of strangers there. Boy leaned slightly toward her, his voice barely a whisper. "Who is it, mother?" She placed her hand firmly on his, and whispered back, "It is the White House son. They want to speak with you." And in that instant, everything shifted. The mocking crew, the curious passengers, the weight of judgment pressing down from the moment he entered first class, all of it seemed to crumble into silence, replaced with the invisible but undeniable presence of power and destiny. The boy's life was no longer the same, for he was no longer just a teenager in a black suit, mocked for daring to sit in first class. He was someone the White House was calling directly at 30,000 feet in the sky. The air felt heavy with suspense as his mother held out the phone toward him, and every beat of his heart seemed to echo against the walls of the cabin. The journey had just begun, and none of the people around him could have imagined how quickly the story of the boy in the black suit would turn from laughter to awe. The voice of power. The boy's fingers hesitated as his mother held the phone toward him, the screen glowing like a doorway into something he could not yet understand. His heart raced so fast he feared it would betray him in front of everyone. The laughter of the crew and the sideways glances from passengers was still fresh in his memory, but in this moment their judgment seemed far away. His hand reached slowly, and he took the phone, pressing it against his ear, his voice trembling as he whispered, "Hello." The voice on the other end was steady, calm, and full of authority. "Good afternoon, young man. This is the office of the President of the United States. I am calling to deliver a message on behalf of the President himself." The boy's throat tightened, he swallowed hard, and his eyes widened in disbelief. The President, his mind struggled to make sense of the words. He looked at his mother, who nodded, urging him to listen. She held his hand tight, as if her touch would anchor him in this storm of revelation. The voice continued, "We are aware of who you are, and we want you to know that your journey is of great importance. You are scheduled to meet with key members of the White House staff upon arrival. This is a matter of both honor and responsibility." The boy's lips parted, but no words came. His heart hammered so loudly he thought everyone around him must hear it. The crew nearby watched from a distance, curiosity etched into their expressions, though they pretended to check on other passengers. The mocking smiles that once carried such confidence had begun to fade, replaced by uncertainty. The boy's voice shook as he asked, "Why me, sir?" The reply came swiftly, "Because your story matters more than you know. You represent something larger than yourself. You carry a legacy that must not be overlooked. You are to be honored for what you will bring into the future." That was all the voice said before giving instructions to stay prepared upon landing. Then the call ended, leaving only silence in its place. The boy lowered the phone slowly, his hands trembling, his breath uneven. He looked at his mother and whispered, "Did that really just happen?" She smiled, though tears glistened in her eyes. "Yes, son, it happened, and you must believe it." The passengers, who had overheard fragments of the conversation, now leaned in, whispering to each other, trying to piece together the mystery. One man in a suit whispered to his wife, "Could it really have been the White House?" Another passenger muttered, "No way, they must be mistaken," yet their doubt could not erase the truth that hung heavy in the air. The lead attendant approached her steps, cautious, her earlier mockery nowhere to be found. She forced a polite smile and asked, in a softer tone, "Is everything all right, sir?" The boy looked at her silently for a moment, remembering the sting of her words earlier, but before he could reply, his mother answered, "Yes, everything is fine, thank you." The attendant hesitated, her eyes flicking to the phone, then to the boy before she nodded and walked away, though the stiffness in her movements betrayed her. Onis, the flight settled into a tense rhythm. People avoided staring too openly, but the whispers did not stop. The boy sat back in his wide leather seat, his thoughts swirling like a storm. His life had been simple until this morning. He was a boy who lived in a small apartment with his mother, who worked 2 jobs to keep their world intact. He was a boy who studied late into the night, driven by dreams of becoming someone who could change the story of his family. Yet now the president's voice had entered his world, and nothing would ever be the same. He closed his eyes and remembered the nights his mother told him stories of perseverance. She would remind him that people would doubt him simply because of how he looked, but that he must always carry himself with dignity, because greatness did not come from acceptance but from resilience. He realized then that this moment was exactly what she had prepared him for. The laughter of the crew was just another wall of doubt, and the White House call was proof that walls could be broken. The boy opened his eyes again and looked at his mother. She held his hand with a fierce grip, her expression calm but proud. "You see, son," she whispered, "they laughed at you because they could not see who you really are. But now the whole world will begin to see. Never forget that you were born for this." The engines roared as the plane climbed higher, the sky outside glowing with streaks of sunlight and the clouds stretching endlessly like pathways to destiny. The boy straightened in his seat, no longer shrinking from the gaze of others around him. Passengers shifted in unease, some sneaking glances that now held something closer to respect or fear rather than ridicule. The boy felt their eyes, but he no longer cared. Their judgment was small compared to the voice he had just heard. Daychild sitting to Rose, her head turned around, and smiled innocently at him. The boy smiled back. For the first time on the flight his heart still pounded, but there was a new strength in his chest. He realized that this call was more than honor, it was responsibility. Whatever awaited him after landing, he would face it with courage. The crew gathered at the front of the cabin, whispering among themselves. One of them looked back at the boy repeatedly, as if trying to read his face. Another chewed nervously on her lip. The lead attendant who had mocked him earlier stood stiffly, her confidence gone. Her voice wavered as she instructed the other attendants to continue serving meals, though her eyes betrayed her distraction. She could not forget the sound of his mother's words when she said, "It is the White House." The plane continued forward through the sky, but inside the cabin, time seemed suspended. The boy's life had split into two before the call. He was just another face laughed at by strangers. After the call, he was someone chosen by the White House. The crew could not laugh anymore. The passengers could not whisper without fear that their mockery might one day be exposed. And the boy sat taller in his seat, his mother's hand over his heart alive with a fire he had never felt before. As the hours passed and the flight drew closer to its destination, the boy replayed the words in his mind. "You represent something larger than yourself." He wondered what legacy the voice had spoken of. He thought of his late father, whom he barely remembered, a man his mother rarely spoke about. Perhaps the connection lay there. Perhaps the White House knew something about his family that he did not. The mystery grew in his chest like a seed ready to break open. His mother closed her eyes, briefly resting, but her hand never left his. Her presence was steady, a shield against the waves of uncertainty. The boy looked at her face, lined with years of struggle, yet shining with pride. He knew she carried secrets of their past, secrets she had never fully shared, and perhaps those secrets were the reason the president himself cared to call them. The hum of the engines filled the silence, but beneath it all there was an undercurrent, a weight pressing down on everyone who had witnessed the shift. No one dared to laugh now, no one dared to question too loudly. The boy who entered the cabin as a target of mockery now sat as a figure of intrigue and silent respect when the pilot's voice crackled over the speakers, announcing the hours left until landing. The boy's heart raced. Again, he felt the pressure of what awaited him on the ground. Would there be officials waiting? Would reporters be there? Would he step off the plane into a world that saw him not as a stranger in a suit, but as someone destined for history? He did not know the answers, but he felt ready to face them. He leaned closer to the window, gazing at the clouds. The sky looked endless, and for the first time he felt that maybe his future was just as vast, just as limitless. The laughter of the crew no longer mattered. The doubts of the passengers no longer mattered. The White House had spoken, and with that one call his life had changed forever. Whispers turned to fear. The cabin that had once been filled with subtle laughter and unkind whispers was now weighed down by an entirely different kind of silence. The boy sat tall in his wide seat, his mother beside him, her eyes closed, though her hand never let go of his. Beside, their connection was a quiet fortress against the chaos unfolding in the minds of the passengers and crew around them. For a while, the only sound was the steady hum of the engines and the faint rustle of pages as someone pretended to read a magazine. Though their eyes flicked often toward the boy in the black suit, started again, but these were not like before. They no longer carried mocking tones, but instead carried the unease of curiosity and the tremor of fear. One passenger leaned closer to another and asked in a low voice, "Did you hear what she said? Was the White House?" The other responded, "I thought it was a joke, but did you see her face? No one looks like that. If it is a prank." A businessman further back whispered to his assistant, "This could mean security risk, or maybe he is someone important. Either way, we'd better keep our distance." The assistant nodded nervously and shifted away from the boy. The crew gathered near the galley. Their voices hushed, but the boy could still sense the tension that dripped from their words. One attendant, who had laughed earlier, rubbed her arms as if cold and muttered, "What if this really is true? What if the White House is actually waiting for him?" The lead attendant, who had mocked him the most before, tightened her jaw and hissed, "Do not be ridiculous. There must be some mistake." But even she could not hide the flicker of worry in her eyes. They had built their superiority on the assumption that he did not belong here. And now that illusion was cracking. The boy felt every pair of eyes that lingered on him. He was used to being looked at differently all his life, but this was not the same. This time the looks carried hesitation, as though the people were measuring him against something unseen and wondering what they had missed. He kept his gaze on the window clouds drifting slowly past like guardians of secrets. He was only beginning to uncover inside his chest. A storm raged. He remembered every insult he had endured back in school when classmates mocked his worn clothes or the way he spoke. He remembered the times his mother worked late nights cleaning offices so that he could study harder than anyone else. He remembered sitting by the window of their small apartment, dreaming of a world where he could rise above the weight of judgment. And now the White House call had come, as if those dreams had never been in vain. His mother squeezed his hand gently, bringing him back from his thoughts. She leaned closer and whispered, "You must stay strong, son. They are watching you. Not with kindness yet, but with fear. You have to show them who you are." The boy nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He wanted to ask her what the White House could possibly want with him, but he knew she would not tell him. Not yet. There was something in her eyes, something she carried like a shield of secrets, and he realized that his mother knew more than she had ever admitted. The hours of the flight crawled forward. The boy tried to lose himself in the rhythm of the engines, but each whisper that floated down the aisle reminded him that his life was no longer the same. Some passengers avoided looking at him entirely, others glanced repeatedly, as if expecting him to reveal some hidden power. One elderly woman offered him a kind smile, and said softly, "Do not mind them, child. You are braver than they will ever be." He returned the smile, his chest warming for the first time since the flight began. Her kindness was a small light against the shadows of fear. The lead attendant returned. Once more her voice strained as she asked, "Would you like anything to drink, sir?" The boy stared at her silently for a moment, remembering her earlier cruelty, but then he simply shook his head politely. His mother answered instead, "We are fine, thank you." The attendant forced a nod, but her face flushed as she retreated. The balance of power had shifted, and she knew it soon. The boy began to notice a new energy moving through the cabin. A quiet anticipation hung in the air like a storm about to break. Passengers whispered into their phones, some trying to confirm if any news had broken about a White House connection on board. One man even tapped furiously on his laptop, trying to find answers. The boy realized that his presence was no longer just an oddity in first class. He was becoming a living mystery, a puzzle that none of them could solve, and the uncertainty unsettled them. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, but his mind would not rest. He kept hearing the words from the voice on the phone, "You represent something larger than yourself." He wondered again about his father, a man whose picture he had seen only a few times, a man his mother rarely spoke of. Yet perhaps this was the missing piece of the puzzle. Perhaps the legacy mentioned had something to do with bloodlines or promises made long before he was old enough to understand. His mother shifted beside him, her eyes open now and full of thought. He could tell she too was replaying the call in her mind. He asked quietly, "Mother, is there something about father you never told me?" Her hand trembled slightly, but she gave a small smile and whispered, "Everything will be revealed in time. For now, trust that you are ready." She would not say more, but her eyes told him that his guess was not far from the truth. The tension in the cabin thickened. The businessman who had earlier mocked him now avoided his gaze entirely. His wife clutched his arm nervously, as if sitting near the boy was somehow dangerous or powerful. The crew no longer laughed. Their tones carried only forced politeness. The boy felt their fear growing like a shadow, stretching longer with every passing miles. The flight moved closer to its destination. The boy realized something important. This fear was not his burden, it was theirs. They had mocked him because they believed he did not belong. They now feared him because they realized he did. He sat taller, his shoulders straight, his chin lifted. He would not shrink from their fear. He would meet it head on. The child too rose ahead, turned again, and waved shyly. The boy waved back, smiling softly, and in that small exchange he felt strength. He was not just carrying his own dreams. He was carrying the hopes of others' children, who might one day walk into rooms where no one thought they belonged, and claim their place. He was carrying his mother's sacrifices, and perhaps even his father's legacy. He was carrying something larger than himself, and the White House had seen it, even if strangers in first class had not. The whispers turned quieter as passengers sensed the change in him. He no longer seemed a boy in an oversized suit, but someone destined for something greater. The unease grew sharper, and some passengers even shifted away, as if distance could shield them from what they could not understand. Fear had replaced ridicule, and the boy knew this was only the beginning. The plane continued forward through the endless sky, but within its cabin, a transformation had already begun. The boy was no longer the subject of laughter. He was the symbol of something far more powerful, and every whisper, every stolen glance, every nervous frown confirmed that his journey into destiny was unfolding, and though he did not yet know where it would lead, he knew one truth for certain. He was not afraid any more. Truth revealed at 30,000 feet. A steady roar of the engines filled the cabin as the aircraft cut through the clouds, yet inside the boy's heart pounded louder than any machine. His mind could not stop circling around the mysterious call from the White House and the unease that rippled through the passengers around him. He sat straighter in his seat, no longer the timid boy mocked at boarding, but someone surrounded by an invisible shield of destiny. His mother's hand was still wrapped around his own, warm and firm, as if to remind him he was not alone. Passengers continued to whisper, though their tones had shifted entirely from ridicule to nervous speculation. Some muttered about politics, some about security, and some about fate. The lead attendant stood stiffly at the front, her earlier smirk gone, replaced with a pale face and lips pressed thin, as if she were waiting for something to collapse around her. The boy caught her glancing at him several times, her eyes full of questions she dared not ask. He turned to his mother, unable to keep his curiosity locked inside any longer. "Mother, tell me the truth. What did that call really mean? Why would the White House know about me?" His voice shook not with fear but with a hunger for answers. His mother looked at him long and deeply, her gaze heavy with the weight of years she had carried alone. She sighed quietly and whispered, "You deserve to know, but once I tell you, your life will no longer be the same." She squeezed his hand and leaned closer, speaking so only he could hear. "Your father," she said slowly, "was not just a man who worked ordinary jobs, as you always believed. He was part of something larger, something connected to those who shaped the nation. He worked closely with people at the highest levels, though he never told you, because he wanted to keep you safe when he passed away. I promised him I would protect you until the time came for the truth to reach you. And now it seems the time has arrived. The call from the White House is not an accident, son. It is the thread of your father's legacy pulling you into the place where you were always meant to stand." The boy felt his breath catch, his heart racing. He remembered faint images of his father, a man with kind eyes and a steady presence. He had never known much about him, only that he had died when the boy was still small. Now the puzzle pieces shifted into place. Could it be true that his father had been tied to the highest offices in the nation? Could it be that the White House remembered him through his son? The revelation made his chest heavy, yet proud at the same time. He was no longer just a boy in a suit on a flight. He was a continuation of a story much bigger than himself. As the truth settled within him, the whispers round the cabin seemed louder than before. Passengers had noticed the way his mother leaned in to speak, and they strained to catch even a word. Some grew restless, unable to bear the uncertainty. A man in a grey suit finally broke the silence, leaning across the aisle and asking bluntly, "Young man, is it true? Are you really connected to the White House?" The boy's mother turned sharply, her eyes fierce with warning, but before she could respond, the boy lifted his chin and spoke firmly, "My father worked for the nation, and the president knows who I am. That is all you need to know." The man's mouth fell open in shock. He leaned back quickly, as if struck by something unseen. The passengers nearby whispered louder, now their faces pale with realization. The lead attendant froze where she stood, her hands clenching together as guilt washed over her. She could no longer hide from the memory of her cruel words. Earlier, the boy felt a strange strength rising within him, a strength he had never known. He thought of all the times he had been dismissed, mocked, or told to step aside, and he realized now that those were never reflections of his worth, but reflections of others' blindness. He was stepping into the truth of who he was, and it changed everything. The pilot's voice crackled through the speaker, then calm, but serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have been informed that special arrangements will be in place upon landing. We ask all passengers to remain seated until further instructions are given. Thank you for your cooperation." The pronouncement sent ripples through the cabin. People exchanged uneasy glances. What special arrangements? What did this mean for them? Who exactly was the boy they had mocked only hours earlier? The boy looked at his mother, her eyes soft but proud. She whispered, "You see, son, they are preparing for you. Your father once walked halls where decisions for millions were made, and now it seems they are calling you to follow in his path. Do not be afraid. You were born for this." The boy nodded, though inside his chest, emotions swirled. Fear, pride, confusion, and determination, all woven together. The lead attendant finally gathered the courage to step forward. She stopped at their row, her voice trembling slightly. "Sir," she addressed the boy, this time with respect. "I owe you an apology, for earlier I should never have spoken to you the way I did. I did not know who you were." He looked at her calmly, his eyes steady, and his voice quiet but firm. "You should not need to know who someone is to treat them with respect." Her face flushed red with shame, and she bowed her head before stepping away. Her earlier arrogance crushed completely. The cabin grew quieter. After that, the passengers no longer dared to whisper too loudly. Their eyes carried respect, now mixed with unease. The boy sat taller than before, his shoulders squared, his gaze steady. He was no longer hiding inside the oversized suit. He was filling it as the flight descended closer to its destination. The anticipation grew heavier. Each mile seemed to draw them nearer to something monumental. The boy's mind spun with possibilities. What would happen once they landed? Would there be officials waiting? Would there be cameras? Would he be asked to carry responsibilities he had never imagined? He felt both terrified and exhilarated. His mother squeezed his hand again, reminding him that no matter how large the world became, he was never alone. The city lights began to twinkle below. As the plane started its descent, the crew prepared the cabin for landing. But their usual routine was stiff with tension. Their eyes kept darting toward the boy, as though each movement they made was under his silent judgment. The boy ignored them, his gaze fixed on the horizon outside the window where the golden glow of the sunset painted the clouds. He felt as if the sky itself was preparing a stage for him to step into destiny. When the wheels finally touched down, the cabin jolted slightly, and a ripple of unease swept through the passengers. The boy's pulse quickened as he realized that everything beyond this point would no longer be the same. The pilot's voice returned clear and firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, upon arrival, please remain seated as special security will be boarding first. We thank you for your patience." The cabin erupted into whispers once more. Some passengers gasped, others muttered in disbelief. The boy looked at his mother one last time. Before the door opened, she leaned close and whispered, "Remember, son, this is only the beginning. Walk proudly into whatever awaits you, because your father's spirit walks with you, and I will always be by your side." He nodded, his eyes burning with unshed tears, his chest swelling with courage. The door opened, and at once a group of suited officials stepped into the cabin, their presence sharp and commanding. Their eyes swept the aisle until they landed on the boy in the black suit. Their leader nodded respectfully toward him and spoke, "We are here for you, sir. Please come with us." Gasps filled the cabin. The passengers who had mocked him fell silent. The crew who had doubted him froze in disbelief. The boy rose slowly, his legs steady, his shoulders square. For the first time he felt the weight of his suit, not as fabric, but as armor. The laughter that had once cut him was gone, replaced by a silence so deep it seemed to honor him. He stepped forward, guided by his mother, and followed the officials toward the door, and as he left the cabin, he carried not just his own story but the truth revealed at 30,000 feet, that he was no longer a boy mocked for daring to dream, but someone chosen, someone connected to a destiny written long before the flight had even begun. Respite replaces ridicule. The cabin remained frozen as the boy stood tall in his black suit, the officials waiting near the door. Their presence filled the space with authority and silence. Every passenger felt the weight of the moment. They had laughed, they had whispered, they had doubted, but now all they could do was watch in awe as the boy rose to his feet. The oversized suit that had once looked awkward now seemed to fit him like a crown of dignity. His mother stood beside him, her head high, her eyes gleaming with a quiet pride. She did not need to speak. Her presence alone carried power. The officials motioned politely for them to come forward, but for a brief moment the boy paused. He looked around the cabin, taking in the faces of those who had mocked him and those who had doubted his worth. Their eyes were wide, some with shame, some with admiration, and some with fear. For the first time, he was no longer the one shrinking under their gaze. It was they who shifted uneasily beneath his calm, steady eyes. The businessman, who had earlier whispered cruel remarks, now lowered his head, unable to meet the boy's stare. His wife clutched his arm nervously, as if she too could feel the sting of their earlier judgment. The elderly woman who had spoken a kind word to him earlier now smiled proudly and gave him a small nod, as though she had always known he was destined for something greater. A child who had waved at him before clapped his hands innocently, his bright eyes shining with admiration. The boy felt a warmth in his chest, and he returned the gesture with a small wave. The Lead attendant, who had mocked him at the start, approached slowly, her face pale and her voice trembling. "Sir," she said softly, "I need to apologize for the way I treated you earlier. I did not know who you were, and I was wrong." Her words were careful but heavy with guilt. The boy studied her for a moment, then spoke in a voice stronger than he realized. "You should not treat people with respect only because of who they are or who they No, respect should always come first." His words were not shouted, but they carried across the cabin like a lesson that every ear heard. The attendant bowed her head, her eyes wet with shame. The boy turned and walked forward with his mother, the officials stepping aside respectfully to allow them passage. The once mocking laughter had been replaced with silence and respect. Each step he took felt like a victory, not just for himself but for every moment in his life when he had been told he did not belong. The aisle that had seemed so long and lonely when he first boarded now felt like a path of honor. He could almost hear his father's voice, urging him to walk with pride. As they reached the door of the aircraft, the officials greeted them with firm nods and guiding hands, but before stepping out, the boy turned one last time to face the cabin. His eyes swept over the passengers and crew, and he spoke clearly enough for all to hear. "You laughed when I walked in. You doubted me because of how I looked, but today you have learned something important. Never measure someone's worth by what you see on the surface. You never know the story behind the suit." His voice did not shake. It carried strength and dignity, and when he finished, the silence was so deep that even the hum of the engines seemed to fade. The boy stepped out of the plane into the cool air of the runway. The officials flanked him and his mother as they walked down the steps. Waiting vehicles lined up below, flashing lights from cameras cut through the dusk, and the distant murmurs of reporters grew louder. Security officers moved with precision, ensuring the path was clear. As his feet touched the ground, he felt the weight of every eye on him, yet he no longer felt small. He felt larger than the moment itself. The passengers inside the cabin leaned against windows, craning their necks to catch one last glimpse. Some whispered in awe, some felt ashamed, some felt inspired, but all of them knew they had witnessed something they would never forget. The boy who entered their world as a target of ridicule had walked out as a figure of respect. His mother walked beside him, her steps graceful, her expression firm and proud. She whispered softly so only he could. "Here you see, son, this is what happens when the truth reveals itself. They tried to laugh you away, but now they must face who you are." The boy nodded, his chest swelling with both pride and humility. He thought of the years his mother had struggled silently for him, of the father he barely remembered who had left behind a legacy that now called to him. He felt the fire of responsibility grow stronger inside. The vehicles were waiting, sleek black cars with tinted windows. Doors opened, and officials gestured for them to enter, but before he stepped inside, the boy paused again. He looked up at the sky. The same sky that had carried him through hours of judgment and revelation. The clouds glowed faintly with the last light of day, and he whispered silently to himself, "I am ready." The car door closed behind him, and the convoy began to move away from the runway. Inside, the boy sat quietly beside his mother. The city lights flickered in the distance, growing closer every moment. The officials spoke briefly about security details and schedules, but the boy barely listened. His mind was alive with thoughts of what lay ahead. He wondered what the president would say. He wondered if the world would know his name tomorrow. He wondered if he was truly ready for the responsibility being placed upon him. His mother placed her hand on his, again her eyes steady. "You will be ready, son," she whispered, "because you have carried respect in your heart, even when others refused to give it. That is why the White House called you, not just for who your father was, but for who you are." The boy swallowed hard, his throat thick with emotion. He leaned back in the seat, the leather cool against his skin, and closed his eyes for a moment, letting her words sink in back. On the plane, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Passengers who had once mocked now spoke in hushed tones about the extraordinary moment they had witnessed. Some even questioned themselves, quietly wondering how many others they had misjudged in their lives. The elderly woman who had defended him earlier whispered to herself, with a smile, "That boy will change the world." The child still clapped happily, his innocent joy, a reminder of the purity adults so often lost. The crew members stood silently, their pride broken, their arrogance replaced with regret. Boy did not know it yet, but the respect that now replaced ridicule was only the beginning. His story was spreading beyond the cabin, already whispered into phones, texted into messages, and soon to reach the ears of many more. But for him, in this moment, it was not fame he cared about. It was the feeling of stepping into the truth of who he was, and the realization that the laughter of others no longer held any power over him. The convoy drove deeper into the city. The boy stared out the window, the lights flashing across his reflection. He saw himself not as the uncertain teen who had boarded the plane, but as someone standing on the threshold of destiny. He whispered, softly so only he could hear, respect must always replace ridicule, and I will carry that truth with me wherever I go. Landing into destiny. The city outside gleamed with lights as the convoy moved smoothly through its streets, every turn guided by flashing escorts that cleared the path. The boy leaned against the window, watching reflections of himself ripple against the glass. The black suit no longer felt oversized, it felt as though he had grown into it. His heart beat fast, but it was not the rhythm of fear anymore, it was the rhythm of purpose. His mother sat beside him, silent yet strong, her presence as steady as the ground beneath him. She held his hand gently and whispered, son, when you step out of this car, the eyes of many will be upon you. Remember what you said to the crew. Remember that respect must always come first. If you hold on to that truth, nothing can shake you. He nodded slowly, his chest rising with deep breaths. His mother's words were not only advice, they were the foundation of who he was. The convoy slowed as it entered a wide avenue, and ahead stood the towering shape of a building illuminated against the night. Its flag waved proudly in the air. The boy felt a chill run through him. The White House was not far now, and the thought of it made his chest swell and his palms sweat at the same time. He thought again of his father and wondered if this path had been waiting for him long before he understood its meaning. The vehicles finally pulled into a secure entrance. Officials opened the doors with respect and urgency. Security surrounded them, but not in a way that suffocated. Instead, it felt protective, guiding. The boy stepped out into the night air, and for the first time he truly felt the weight of history pressing down and lifting him up all at once. Cameras flashed in the distance, their lights like tiny bursts of thunder. Reporters shouted questions, though their words blurred into noise. He did not answer, he simply walked with his mother at his side, the officials leading them forward through polished halls and corridors. Inside, the air was cool and steady. The walls lined with portraits of past leaders seemed to watch him as he walked. Each step echoed against marble floors, and every echo seemed to whisper, you belong here. His mother's steps were sure beside him, though he could feel the slight tremor in her hand. She too was moved by the gravity of the moment. Finally they were guided into a room that glowed with warm light. A large desk stood at the far end, and behind it a man rose to his feet. His presence was powerful, yet calm, his eyes kind, yet sharp. The boy recognized him at once. The President of the United States was walking toward him. The boy's breath caught, his heart surged, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. The president extended his hand, and the boy reached forward, clasping it firmly. The president's voice was steady and rich. Young man, welcome. I have heard much about you, and I am honored to finally meet you. The boy felt his throat tighten. He could not find words at first. His mother's gentle squeeze gave him strength. He managed to reply softly, thank you, sir. The president smiled and gestured for them to sit together. They settled into chairs, and the boy felt the weight of the moment settle round him like a matulder. President spoke again. Your father was a man of courage. He gave his life in service to this country in ways that many will never know. His work was quiet but vital, and it saved countless lives. He believed deeply in the future, and before he passed, he asked us to remember you. He said that one day his son would walk into this house, not as a visitor, but as someone meant to carry his legacy forward. Today, that day has come. The boy felt tears sting his eyes. He lowered his gaze, his chest heavy with emotion. He whispered, I did not know all that about him. The president leaned closer. That is why we called you. You are not here because of privilege. You are here because of strength, character, and the fire you carry in your heart. We see it, and we honor it. The boy swallowed hard and lifted his head, his eyes wet but steady. I do not know if I am ready, sir. The president smiled gently. None of us ever feel ready at the start, but destiny does not wait. It calls, and we answer. The boy felt the truth of those words sink into him. He thought of the laughter of the crew, the ridicule of the passengers, the fear that later replaced their doubt. He thought of the long nights his mother worked for him, the sacrifices she had made, and the legacy of his father. And in that moment he understood he was ready, not because he had all the answers, but because he had walked through ridicule and still stood with dignity. The president continued, you will have opportunities to learn, to grow, and to serve in ways that will shape the future. This is only the beginning, but remember this, you must always hold yourself with respect and extend respect to others. No matter how they treat you, that will be your greatest strength." The boy nodded silently, those words becoming a promise inside his heart. After the meeting, the boy and his mother were guided through the halls again. Each step felt different now. They were not walking as strangers or outsiders. They were walking as honored guests, carrying the weight of history. The boy gazed at the portraits once more, and instead of feeling small beneath their gaze, he felt connected, as though one day his story might be written among them. As they left the building, the night air greeted them again, but this time the world outside seemed changed. The reporters still shouted, but their voices were tinged with awe. Not doubt. The cameras still flashed, but their lights seemed to illuminate, not mock. His mother held his hand tighter than ever, whispering, "You see, son, the world that once laughed will one day look up to you. Never forget who you are." The boy lifted his chin, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He no longer felt the sting of laughter. He no longer carried the weight of fear. He carried something greater, a destiny that had unfolded at 30,000 feet and landed here in the heart of power. He whispered quietly to himself, so only he could hear, "I will honor this. I will walk with respect. I will make them proud." And as the cars carried them away into the night, the boy knew that his journey was only beginning. He had walked onto the plane as a mocked teenager, but he had walked off into destiny. The White House had called, and he had answered. The world would never see him the same again, and more importantly, he would never see himself the same again. The end.